The will was read on a Thursday afternoon in August, in a solicitor's office above the Strand, in a room that smelled of old paper and beeswax and the particular airless heat of a London summer that has gone on 2 weeks longer than anyone can bear. The light came in flat and yellow through windows nobody had thought to open, and the gathered family of the late Duke of Whitfield sat in their chairs in varying degrees of grief and calculation, and the solicitor cleared his throat and began. There were 12 people in that room. Lady Clara, the Duke's only legitimate daughter, sat beside her mother, the Dowager Duchess, holding a handkerchief she had not needed yet. There was Mr. Alistair Langley, the Duke's distant cousin and nearest male relation, who sat very still in the way of a man who has been counting on something and does not want anyone to see him counting. There was a cluster of solicitors and men of business. And there, in the corner by the window, in the grey dress of a companion, in the place where a companion stands so that she is present without being noticed, there was Miss Rosalind Langley. She had been in the room for 40 minutes. No one had spoken to her. She had not expected them to. She had a document folded in her left hand. She had been holding it since the morning. It was a letter written in her father's handwriting. She knew it as her own, that cramped, careful hand, and addressed to a solicitor she had never heard of, and she had carried it the whole journey from Whitfield Abbey without opening it again, because she already knew what it said, and knowing was enough, and hoping was more than she had permitted herself in a very long time. The solicitor began with the estates in Yorkshire, and the houses in London, and various sums and charitable endowments, and Rosalind stood in her corner and watched the room, and she counted her own heartbeats, the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder, trying to gauge the distance of the storm. And then the solicitor said, "Whitfield Abbey, situate in the parish of Whitfield in the county of Gloucestershire, together with the entirety of its grounds, outbuildings, and appurtenances, including the rose gardens established by the late Duchess Consort in the year 1789, and maintained to the present day, to pass in trust and then in perpetuity to Miss Rosalind Langley, natural daughter of the deceased, on the condition that the said Miss Langley shall be lawfully married within a period of 6 calendar months of the date of inheritance, failing which the property shall—" The room stopped. Not loudly, not all at once. It stopped the way a held breath stops, the collective suspension of a dozen people who have just heard something that rearranges the furniture of the world, and who require a moment to stand in the rearranged room and understand where the walls are now. And then, from the other side of the room, a man stood up. He was tall. He would have been tall even in a room that was not pressing in from the heat, but in this room he seemed to take up more of the available air than anyone else present. Dark curls, a set jaw, the particular stillness of a man choosing, very carefully, how angry to be. Lord Theodore Kilmore, Earl of Kilmore. Rosalind knew who he was. She had made a point, in the weeks since her father's illness had turned final, of knowing exactly who he was. "The Kilmore family," said the Earl, in a voice that was very even and therefore more dangerous than shouting, "has held a claim of ancient right to Whitfield Abbey for 200 years. That bequest is invalid." The solicitor looked at him over his spectacles. "My lord, the document is the document of a dying man attempting to bestow what was never legally his to bestow. I shall be taking this matter to Chancery." He turned, and his gaze moved across the room until it found Rosalind in her corner, and she met it with the steadiness she had been practicing since she was 12 years old, and something crossed his face. She could not have said whether it was contempt or surprise or the beginning of something else entirely, and he looked away and sat back down. "Within the fortnight." Rosalind unfolded the letter in her left hand. She had been holding it since the morning. She was going to need it sooner than she had thought. Now, before I carry you one step further in this story, before the roads and the roses and the long Cotswold, autumn, I want to ask you something, and I hope you will not think me presumptuous, because I am only a woman sitting by a fire with a tale she has been waiting to tell. Wherever you are tonight, whether you're in a garden or a city or somewhere in between, in the quiet of a house that is going to sleep around you, I want you to subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, because this is one of my favorites, and I would hate for you to miss what the Abbey has yet to show us. It is free, and it means the world, and if you will not do it, then you owe me one. And I am very patient, and I never forget. Now, come back with me to the beginning, to a woman who has always belonged somewhere, without anyone ever having told her so. Before Rosalind Langley was the shock of a solicitor's reading, before she was the unexpected inheritor, before she was any of the things she would become in the months to come, she was a child who had once walked through a gate in a garden wall and found herself somewhere she had not known existed. She had been 8 years old. Her mother, a woman of modest birth and considerable composure, who had loved the Duke of Whitfield with the particular loyalty of someone who had never been deceived about what she was to him, had brought her to Whitfield Abbey for the summer. Not openly, not as anything that required acknowledging. They had stayed in the gardener's cottage, she and her mother, for 3 weeks, and her mother had tended the rose beds at the south end of the grounds, the beds that the legitimate Duchess had planted with obsessive care, and then abandoned when the pleasures of London proved more reliable than the pleasures of the Cotswolds. Rose had followed her mother through the garden with the unquestioning confidence of a child who knows she is loved, and she had learned the names of things. That was the gift. The names of things. Not only the roses, though the roses became her own private language, a system of knowledge so complete and particular that she could tell you, blindfolded, the difference between a damask and a centifolia by scent alone, and the difference between a gallica and an alba by the feel of the leaf, and the difference between 100 varieties of pink by a complexity of shade that no one who had not spent a childhood in the beds could have articulated. She had learned the names of the bees and the names of the old stone walls and the name of the path that went along the kitchen garden that was called the Pilgrim's Way, because it had been walked by monks 400 years before any duke had ever thought to claim the land. She had learned that summer, and in the summers that followed, for her mother brought her back every year. And then, after her mother died, she came herself, the whole vocabulary of a place that had never formally acknowledged her. Her father had not been cruel. She wanted to be fair about that, as she had always tried to be fair about it, because fairness was one of the things she had taught herself as a matter of survival. He had not been cruel. He had been afraid of his wife, of his title, of the machinery of a world that did not permit illegitimate daughters to complicate the proper machinery of inheritance, and afraid men do small and insufficient things that look, from the outside, very much like cruelty. He had given her mother money. He had ensured Rose's education. He had, twice, stood at the far end of the rose garden and watched her work among the beds without speaking to her, which she had understood, from the distance of 30 yards, as the only kind of acknowledgement he could manage. She had nodded to him once and gone back to her pruning, and they had never spoken of it. Clara did not know. That was the arrangement. Lady Clara, 2 years older than Rose, legitimate and lovely, and entirely certain of her place in the world, knew Rose only as her companion, a quiet, capable, not quite plain young woman who read to her and managed her correspondence and accompanied her to balls with the discreet efficiency of someone who had been trained, by long practice, to make herself useful without being noticed. Clara was not unkind to her. Clara had simply never had reason to wonder very deeply about Rosalind Langley's origins, And Rose, who had learned very young that the safest kind of knowledge was knowledge that nobody wanted, had never given her reason. She had one other thing, and it mattered more than she usually let herself acknowledge. She had Mr. Finch, who was not her father, and did not pretend to be, but who had been the steadiest presence of her life from the age of 8 onward. He had the quality of a man who has spent 40 years in gardens and has consequently developed patience beyond what is available to indoor people. He taught her when she needed teaching and left her alone when she needed that instead. He kept her mother's letters without being asked to. He answered her letters from London. Brief, seasonal reports. One white rose opened in the north border on Tuesday. The damask against the east wall will need staking before the autumn. With the consistency of a person who understands that what he is really reporting is, "We are here, the garden is here, and when you come back, the gate will be open." The roses she learned from him were specific, not the general category, but the individual plant. The rose of Castile in the south bed had been grown from a cutting taken by a Tudor-era abbess. It bloomed once, extravagantly in early June, and spent the rest of the year looking entirely ordinary. The white moss rose on the northeast corner of the old kitchen garden, was the last survivor of a planting described in a garden journal from 1680, and Rose had spent 2 summers propagating it from cuttings so that it would never be entirely lost. The centifolia in the main formal beds bloomed in 50 shades of pink that collapsed into each other at close range and separated into distinct personalities the moment you stepped back, and she had a name for each of them the way some people had names for children. Mr. Finch had found this neither excessive nor eccentric. He had said once in the potting shed, over the tea that was always there waiting when she arrived, "You see things as they actually are, Miss Rosalind. Most people see what they expect. That is not a small thing." She had held that sentence for years. She held it still. When her father's illness began to show its final face, in the spring of that year, Rosalind had gone to Whitfield Abbey one last time. Not at his invitation. He had not quite managed that. She had gone because Mr. Finch, the Abbey's head gardener, who was 63 years old and had known Rose's mother, had sent her a single line in a plain envelope. "The roses need tending." And Rosalind had packed a bag and gone. She had spent 2 weeks at the Abbey with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair coming out of its pins, and she had cut back the climbing roses on the east wall and staked the damask beds and cleared the old season's dead wood from the white rose of the north garden. The Rosa alba that grew against the stone wall, the one that Mr. Finch called the old Duchess without explanation, the one that smelled on warm mornings of something so clean and particular that it was less like a scent than like a sound, the kind of clarity that carries a long way. She had done all of this, and Mr. Finch had given her tea in the potting shed each morning, and on the last day she had said to him, "Do you think he knew I was here?" And Mr. Finch had said, "I think he always knew, Miss Rosalind." I think that was the point. That letter had come a week later. A solicitor she had never heard of, a bequest she had never been told to expect. 6 months and a marriage clause that she regarded, if she was honest, as the single piece of the whole arrangement she was least able to explain. She had 2 theories about the marriage clause. The first was that her father, even in death, had been unable to fully commit to the revolutionary gesture, and the condition was a concession to the world's expectations, a hedge, a qualification, "this is for you, but only if you can make it respectable." The second theory, which she reached for on the better days, was that her father had known her better than she had ever given him credit for, and that the condition was not a hedge, but an invitation, a way of saying, "Here is the thing I am giving you, and here is a door, and beyond the door is a life, and I want you to walk through it rather than guard the gardens alone for the rest of your days." She preferred the second theory. She had not yet found anyone who made walking through the door seem like a reasonable prospect. She was prepared to work on that. She had, after all, 6 months. The Earl of Kilmore had been told about the Whitfield claim for the first time when he was 9 years old, by his father, in a room at the family seat in Ireland, where the ceiling had a water stain shaped approximately like the British Isles, and the fire always smoked in the east wind. He had not entirely understood it at 9. His father had said, "The Abbey belongs to us. The courts have been wrong, and one day we will make them right." And Theodore had said, "Yes, Papa," and meant it in the uncomplicated way of a child who believes whatever his father believes, because his father is the most certain thing in the room. His father had died when Theo was 12. The debts he left were extraordinary. The claim to Whitfield Abbey, which the Kilmore family had maintained in the Chancery courts and in the family's collective consciousness since 1640, when a Kilmore ancestor had drawn the short straw in some aristocratic card game and lost the deed to a duke who later turned out to have been a very good card player and a very dishonest man. The claim to the Abbey was at that point the one thing the Kilmore family had left that was not mortgaged or sold or quietly gone. It was an idea, a right, a thing that could not be taken away because it had never been conceded. And Theo, at 12, with the house going cold around him and the water stain spreading, had picked it up and carried it because there was no one else to carry it. He was not, he thought sometimes, a man naturally suited to bitterness. He had observed enough truly bitter men to know the difference between the bitterness that comes from disappointment and the rigidity that comes from carrying too much for too long. And what he carried was the second variety, a clenching rather than a sour note, a hardening of the edges rather than a darkening of the whole. He had managed the Kilmore estate with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned that efficiency is the only luxury available to him. He had not married because he had not met anyone who seemed worth the particular vulnerability of it, and because the honest truth was that the Kilmore seat in Ireland, for all that it was his, had never once felt like a home. It was a building. It had rooms and a staff and a history, but it did not, and he had never said this aloud to anyone, it did not feel inhabited in the way that a true home feels inhabited. It felt like a duty he performed daily, and duties, however faithfully performed, do not keep you warm. He had, his whole adult life, a habit of arriving places early and standing at the windows to sketch them. The windows of solicitors' offices, the windows of inn rooms, the windows of every house party he had ever suffered through. He had dozens of sketchbooks, all landscapes, all windows. He had never shown them to anyone. They were the record of a man looking for the view that would tell him where he was supposed to be. He was not, he was also aware, a man who had been given much practice at ease. His mother, who had died when he was 19, had been warmth and ease-made person, and her death had left the Kilmore household with the quality of a fire that has gone out in a room that was not designed for any other source of heat. He had filled the gap the only way he knew, with thoroughness, with responsibility, with the kind of management that earned respect without requiring affection. The tenants at the Irish seat knew him as fair. The family solicitors knew him as exacting. His friends, and there were friends, though the word was perhaps a little formal for what he meant, knew him as reliable and good company and not entirely easy to know. None of these things troubled him in the abstract. They troubled him occasionally in the practical sense of a man who comes back to a house at the end of a long day and finds it very quiet and understands, in the quiet, that quiet is not the same as peace. He had been to Whitfield Abbey exactly once when he was 24, visiting the site of his family's great grievance with the thorough due diligence of a man who understood that you had to know what you were fighting for. He had walked the grounds alone, the Duke being absent in London, and the skeleton staff having no reason to stop a caller who presented himself with a card. He had walked the rose gardens in the June afternoon, and the scent had been something out of a different order of experience. Not merely flowers, but time itself, the accumulated careful attention of 100 years of cultivation, the smell of a place that was loved. He had walked through it for 2 hours, and then he had sat on a stone bench near the white rose of the north wall, and he had sketched the view from memory, because he could not find the angle that held everything he was seeing, and he had thought, this is what a home is supposed to feel like. He had written that down in the sketchbook afterward, not a drawing, just that sentence. He had not looked at it since. He was looking at it now, in the solicitor's office above the Strand, in the moment after the will had been read, and he had stood up and said what he was required by duty and inheritance to say. He could not see the sketchbook. It was at the Kilmore townhouse, 3 streets away. But he could feel the sentence with the particular accuracy of something written in a language you have not forgotten, even when you tried. He looked at Rosalind Langley in the corner of the room, with her folded letter and her steady eyes, and he thought, she has been here before. Not in this room, in the situation, in the position of the person who knows the claim is good and knows the room will not receive it well, and has decided, nonetheless, not to leave. He recognized it with the uncomfortable clarity of a man who has stood in exactly that position himself. He looked away. He had made his statement. Chancery would do the rest. He did not know, going out of that room into the August street, that he would be inside the Abbey gardens within a fortnight, or that the view from the bench near the white rose wall would look different now that he knew who had been tending it. Rosalind arrived at Whitfield Abbey on a Tuesday morning in late August, with a single trunk, her gardening gloves in her hand, and Mr. Finch at the gate to meet her. "Miss Rosalind," he said, with the particular quality in his voice of a man who has been waiting for the right person to come through a gate for a long time. "Mr. Finch," she said, and took the hand he offered, and stood for a moment, looking at the Abbey's golden stone in the morning sun, the long west face of it, the wisteria that had gone untrimmed on the east wing, the glimpse of the rose beds beyond the gate, and she thought, I am home, and let the thought be exactly as large as it was. By noon she had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and was in the damask beds with a pair of shears, and the summer heat smelled of the roses' last heavy flowering, and the bees were absolute about their business, and for 3 days the Abbey was entirely, peacefully hers. The Earl of Kilmore arrived on a Thursday. She heard the carriage on the drive, and stood up from the centifolia bed, shears in hand, and waited. He came around the corner of the south wing on foot. He had left the carriage at the front, apparently, and he stopped when he saw her, and she saw the precise moment when he worked out what he was looking at. A woman in a working apron with dirt on her hands, and a pair of pruning shears, and a complete absence of anything resembling embarrassment about any of it. "Miss Langley," he said. "Lord Kilmore," she said. "I was informed that the court's arrangement granted me joint occupancy of the main house and the ground." "Yes," said Rosalind. "I have prepared the east wing for you. Mr. Finch will show your man where to put your things. The west wing is mine. The boundary of the gardens is, for the purposes of access, shared, meaning that neither of us has the right to exclude the other from any part of the grounds pending the review. I have read the order of joint occupancy very carefully. You are welcome here, my lord. I simply ask that you do not stand on the damask beds. The roots are fragile. He looked at the damask beds. He looked at her. He said, in a tone she recognized as the tone of a man recalibrating, "You have been here before." "I have been here every summer since I was 12, said Rosalind, "with the exception of the 2 summers I had bronchitis. I know every bed in these gardens. I know which of the climbing roses on the east wall have canker and which have simply gone leggy, and I know what the soil needs in the south border. And I know that the white rose of York in the north garden has not been properly cared for since the March storms and needs attention this week if it is not to lose the autumn growth." She paused. "I also know that your family's claim to this property was last reviewed by Chancery in 1798 and was at that time found to be legally insufficient, and that the documentation you are citing predates 3 subsequent revisions of property law. I have the documents. I have also taken the liberty of engaging a solicitor with a particular expertise in contested testamentary bequests." She picked up her shears. "As I said, you are welcome here. I hope you will be comfortable." That night, unable to sleep, she walked the garden paths in the dark as she had done 100 times before, and she came around the corner of the north wall and stopped. The Earl of Kilmore was standing in the moonlight beside the white rose of York, not speaking, not doing anything, simply standing, looking at it, with the expression of a man who has found something he thought he had imagined. She did not make her presence known. She stood at the garden's edge and watched him look at the roses, and something in the watching shifted slightly in a direction she had not expected, and she went back to the house and said nothing about it in the morning. He said nothing either, but he asked Mr. Finch, the following day, to show him where the watering cans were kept. The first weeks of joint occupancy established their rhythms the way all things are established at the beginning, badly, and then gradually better, and then, in certain moments, surprisingly well. The mornings were the easiest. Rose was in the gardens early, before the dew had gone, when the light came in low and golden, and the roses gave their best account of themselves, and she and Mr. Finch worked in a companionable quiet that had been built over 15 years and needed no maintenance. The Earl appeared, the 3rd morning, at the gate of the south garden with a mug of tea and the particular expression of a man who would rather be outside than in, but has not yet worked out how to say so. She handed him a second pair of gloves without comment. He put them on. She showed him what needed doing. He did it without either of them making a thing of it, and that was how it started. She taught him the roses the way she taught everything, by touch and smell and name, not by category. Not "this is a damask rose," in the airy way of a natural history lecture, but "this one. Put your hand here, feel the texture of this leaf. This is the Rose of Castile, the oldest damask on the grounds. She was here before the Abbey was rebuilt in 1740, and she'll outlast both of us if we keep the aphids off." He listened. He was better at listening than she had expected, which told her something about the difference between his public manner and his private one. In public, he occupied rooms as though they were there to hold him. In the garden, he moved more carefully, as though he understood that the garden had been there first. He showed her the estate ledgers in return, which she had suspected would be grim and turned out to be grimmer than suspected. The Abbey had been maintained on the income from the Yorkshire farms and a small annual sum from the Duke's investments, neither of which was quite sufficient, and the south wall of the orangery needed extensive work, and there were 3 tenant cottages whose roofs had been a matter of concern since the previous winter. Rose looked at the figures and saw not disaster but difficulty, which was manageable if one approached it correctly, and she said so. And Theo looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been expecting to be told something is hopeless and has been surprised by the alternative. "You have done this before," he said. I have managed a household on very little money for 5 years, said Rose. The principle is the same. You look at what can be deferred and what cannot, and you address the cannot first, and you find what can be traded for what you need. She pointed to a line in the ledger. The rose cuttings. Do you know what the centifolia cuttings from this garden are worth to a serious collector? I have been supplying the Kew Gardens with cuttings for 3 years under Mr. Finch's name. We could formalize that arrangement and sell commercial quantities this autumn. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Under Finch's name, he said. It was easier than explaining. Everything about your situation, he said, with a dry precision she was beginning to recognize as his version of humor, has apparently been conducted under someone else's name for a very long time. Yes, said Rose. I am hoping to change that. The rainstorm came on a Friday afternoon in early September. Without much warning, the sky had been building all morning, and then by 3 o'clock it simply came down, with the flat, emphatic authority of an English autumn making its first argument. Rosalind was in the north garden, cutting back the last of the Gallica roses before the weather changed, and the rain arrived before she had time to do more than register it, and she ran for the long rose arbour at the garden's north end, the old stone arch covered in climbing roses that had been trained over it for 60 years, and pushed in under the thatch of foliage. Theo was already there. He had apparently been sketching the north wall from under the arbour, because his sketchbook was in his hand and he was wet across the shoulders, but his hands were dry, and he looked at her with the very slight widening of expression that was, she had learned, his version of being startled. She stood under the arch, her hair going loose and wet, and looked back at him. The Gallica beds need covering before the rain stops, she said. There is canvas in the potting shed, he said. I know where the canvas is, she said, which came out sharper than she intended, because she had been on the edge of saying something else entirely, and the sharpness was not really about the canvas. They stood in the rain sound under the arch and argued about the beds, and then about the drainage in the south garden, and then about something more abstract, involving whether the roses in the catalogue system could be sold at a different price point if she marketed them under the Abbey's name, rather than as anonymous cuttings. And at some point in the middle of this argument, she became aware that the rain had intensified, and that the distance between them under the arch was rather less than it had been at the argument's beginning, because they had both been leaning in to hear each other over the rain. And she became aware, also, that Theo had stopped speaking about drainage and was looking at her with the complete full attention of a man who has, very suddenly, arrived somewhere he had not been planning to go. The rain ran in a steady sheet off the arch above them. The roses dripped and smelled extraordinary. She said something about the canvas. She was not sure afterward what she had said, but it gave them both something to move toward, and they separated, and the moment passed in the practical direction of waterproof coverings and garden stakes, and she held on to the thread of the argument about pricing all the way back to the house, and over dinner the conversation was entirely civil and perfectly normal, except that he poured her tea before she asked for it, which he had not done before, and she noticed it and did not mention it. He had left his sketchbook on the potting shed table. She had not looked in it. She had thought about it for 2 days before she stopped thinking about it, and by the time she had stopped, something had shifted in the architecture of the whole situation that she could not name precisely, but felt in the way you feel a garden turning. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulated evidence of 100 small things going different from how they went before. The cataloguing evenings were something else again. Mr. Finch had been keeping informal records of the rose varieties for 30 years, in a system that made perfect sense to him and to no one else. And Rose had been translating his records into something that could be sent to Kew and eventually sold against a proper horticultural index. She had brought the cataloguing project back to the orangery, and Theo had found it there one evening and asked what she was doing, and she had explained, and he had said, "Let me help." She had expected him to mean the administrative part, the columns, the cross-referencing, but he had meant the whole thing, and he sat across the table from her in the evening lamplight, going through the index with the focused seriousness of a man who takes on any task he has accepted with the full weight of his attention. They worked for 3 evenings on it, before she noticed that the ledger had been reorganized in a way that was significantly more logical than her version, and when she said so, he said only, "I was good at mathematics at school," which turned out to be the beginning of a conversation about what each of them had been good at in school, and what had been done with those abilities afterward, and what they would have done with them in other circumstances, and which ran until the candles needed replacing, and the orangery had gone from warm to simply not cold. And Mr. Finch had come in at 10 o'clock to see about the stove, and had gone away again without saying anything. There had been a moment, one of those evenings, when she was reaching across the table to point out something in the ledger, and he reached for the same page, and their hands were close enough that she could have touched him if she had moved 2 inches in the wrong direction, and she had not moved. But she had been aware of the 2 inches for the rest of the evening, in the way you are aware of a thing you have decided not to do, which is a different quality of awareness from simply not having thought of it. The dawn ride happened the 3rd week of September, because they were both, it turned out, people who could not remain indoors past first light. She had found him in the stable yard at 5:15 in the morning, saddling his horse, and they had ridden out together without quite deciding to, along the path that went south through the old woodland to the high meadow where the Abbey's lands ended and the next valley began. At the meadow's edge, they stopped, and the light was coming up grey-pink over the hills, and the whole of the Cotswold Valley below was still in shadow, and Theo sat on his horse very quietly for a long time. He said, without looking at her, "I have been looking for this view for 15 years. She waited. "There is a sketchbook," he said, "full of windows, different houses, different estates. I have been trying to draw the thing I am looking for, and I have never found it." He was quiet for another moment. "This morning, looking at the valley, I understood that I had been drawing the wrong thing. It is not a view, it is a feeling." He looked at her then, and the light was doing something to his face that she had not seen on it before. "The Abbey has not felt like a building to me these last weeks. It has felt like a place where someone lives. I do not know if you understand the difference." "I understand it completely," said Rose. They rode back in the morning light without saying much, and Mr. Finch, watching from the potting shed door, said nothing at all, and later wrote in his private journal only, "Progress." She found them on a Wednesday afternoon in October, behind a loose stone in the wall of the old still room, the room that had been her mother's domain in those summer visits, where the rose petals had been dried and pressed and sorted, and the smell of which was so particular and so her mother's that coming into it always required a moment of still adjustment. She had been looking for an old ledger of Mr. Finch's. Instead, she found a canvas-wrapped packet tied with string that had gone stiff with age, and inside the canvas there were letters. Not many. 11, in 2 different hands. Her mother's hand she knew immediately. The other hand she knew as well, because she had made it her business over the years to know her father's handwriting. And this was it. But younger. The ink was more confident, and the sentences ran faster than the careful, cramped hand of his later years. She sat down on the stone floor of the still room with the letters in her lap and read them all through twice. Her mother had been married to the Duke of Whitfield in November of 1793. Not a secret in the way of things hidden and shameful, but secret in the way of things done too quickly and too honestly, by two people who had not yet understood the machine they were caught in. There had been a ceremony, a church, a vicar, two witnesses, a marriage, by every legal and ecclesiastical definition, properly performed. There had also, 18 months later, been a codicil, a document drawn up by the Duke's family solicitors under pressure from his father, the old Duke, which declared the ceremony irregular on the grounds of a procedural defect that Rose was fairly certain had been invented for the occasion. Her mother had signed it. The letter her mother had written the week after signing it was the one that Rose read 3 times, because it was the kind of letter that a person writes from the bottom of something, and it said, "I have done what was required. I do not regret it, because I do not believe that what was made between us can be unmade by a piece of paper. He is a good man, caught in a machinery that is stronger than goodness. Our daughter will know she is loved, that is, what I can give her." Rosalind sat on the floor of the still room for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the old stone. From outside, very faintly, she could hear the sound of secateurs in the garden. Theo, who had taken to working the east beds in the afternoons when the light was good. She was thinking very clearly, which was its own kind of shock, because the letters warranted feeling, and she was feeling, but underneath the feeling she was thinking, and the thinking had a shape. The marriage, if the codicil was void, and she had reasons to believe it was, because the procedural defect cited was one that the courts had addressed directly in 1802 in a case involving a Scottish estate, and the correction had been retroactive. The marriage, if void was an insufficient description, meant that she was not the natural daughter of the Duke of Whitfield. She was the legitimate daughter, which made the inheritance not a charitable bequest to be questioned, but a legal certainty. It also meant that the Duke's subsequent marriage, Clara's mother, had been contracted while the first marriage was, depending on one's reading of the 1802 decision, either void or not void, which was either nothing or it was bigamy, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a family scandal and a family destruction, and Clara's prospects, Clara's marriage, Clara's settled life, were threaded through the middle of it. She did not go to Theo that evening. She went to Mr. Finch, because there were things she needed to ask him, and because she trusted him with every piece of herself she had, and because he looked at the letters and said, quietly, "Yes, I knew. I have known since the beginning. Your mother asked me to keep them safe for you." And then, because she had been taught by years of loving this man that honesty was the only currency that held its value, she said, "Who else should know this?" Mr. Finch said, "I think you already know the answer to that, Miss Rosalind." She knew. She did not want to know, but she knew. She told Theo the following morning, in the orangery, over the tea that had become their morning habit, the sun coming through the glass panes and warming the air past the usual September grey. She put the letters on the table between them, and told him what they said, and what they meant, and what the risk was. She watched his face as she spoke. She had become, over the weeks of the Abbey, a reader of his face in the particular way you become a reader of a landscape you have walked many times, not because the landscape has easy terrain, but because you have learned where the hidden things are. He read the letters, all 11 of them. He took longer over her mother's than over her father's, which she noted. When he put them down, he was quiet for a while. "If the codicil is void," he said, "your claim is stronger than anyone in that solicitor's room understood." "Yes," said Rose. "And if you use these letters to establish that, The question of the Duke's later marriage becomes a matter of legal record. Yes. Which would affect Clara. Yes. He was quiet again. She waited, because she had told him the truth, and now he had to decide what to do with it. And the deciding was his, and she was not going to rush it. "What do you want to do?" he said. And this was the thing that shifted the geometry of the whole relationship in a way she had not entirely expected, because the question was not strategic. It was not what are the legal options, or what does your solicitor advise. It was what do you want, and it was asked with the full attention of a man who actually intended to hear the answer. She said, "I want to protect Clara. I want the Abbey. I do not see a way to have both, and I cannot choose between them. And I have not slept properly since Wednesday because of it." Theo looked out through the orangery glass at the rose beds. He said, "I know a woman in Chancery whose family has navigated questions of this kind before, discreetly. There may be a way to establish the claim without forcing the larger question into record. It would require time and care and a degree of cooperation between our two solicitors that has not, to this point, characterized their relationship." Rose looked at him. "Our two solicitors," she said. "Our two solicitors," he said, with a steadiness that included a great deal more than the solicitors. And they both understood that, and neither of them said anything more about it for the moment, because there was work to do, and the work was its own kind of honesty. The letter from Mr. Alistair Langley arrived on a Monday. It was politely worded and contained between the lines a threat of the kind that is most dangerous because it cannot easily be quoted. Alistair Langley was, by every measure, Rose had been able to apply to him over the years of being his distant relation, a man of considerable intelligence in the service of very small ambitions. He was clever in the way of a person who has decided that cleverness should be used primarily for getting ahead of other people, and he had spent 40 years cultivating the kind of social position that depended entirely on the Langley name and the assumption that the Langley name still meant something. The letter said, in its careful wording, he was coming to the Abbey to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding the will. He would arrive Friday. Rose showed Theo the letter on Tuesday morning. She had, by this point, stopped pretending there was a version of the Abbey's situation in which she navigated alone. Not because she had become dependent on him, she was too clear-eyed about her own history for that, but because the alliance between them had become something that had its own reality and its own weight, and ignoring it in favor of solitary competence would have been, she thought, an act of dishonesty, and she was done with dishonest acts. Theo read the letter twice and said, "He has documents." "He will claim to," said Rose. "Whether they are genuine is another question. Alistair Langley's relationship with documentation has always been creative." "I want Finch at the meeting," said Theo. She looked at him. "You believe Finch has something relevant?" "I believe Finch has been keeping things for you for 15 years, he said, "and that a man who keeps things that carefully keeps them for a reason." He was not wrong. She had thought this herself and had not been ready to take it to its conclusion. She went that afternoon to the potting shed and said to Mr. Finch, "Is there anything else?" And Mr. Finch, who had been waiting for this question for rather a long time, opened the second drawer of his old desk and took out a letter. This one was in her father's later hand, the careful, cramped one she knew, and it was addressed to Mr. Finch personally, and it said, "If any man brings documents to the Abbey claiming they supersede the terms of my will, produce this." It was dated 4 months before the Duke's death. It said, in the calm, plain language of a man who had finally got to the end of his evasions, "I have known all my life what I should have done. I have done the lesser things and called them prudent. I will not be prudent now. The Abbey goes to Rose. The gardens were her mother's, the roses were hers. If anyone attempts to overturn this, show them what is in the hidden drawer of the still room and tell them that I knew exactly what I was doing and that I will be accountable for it in the place where accountability is final. Let Rose have her home. She read this in the potting shed with the afternoon light going gold around the edges of the dirty window, and she sat very still for a moment with it, and then she put it carefully in her pocket and went to find Theo. She found him in the rose garden. He had his sketchbook out, and he was drawing the north wall from the stone bench, the same view he had drawn on his first visit 8 years ago. She knew now, because she had eventually looked in the sketchbook, with his knowledge, on a morning when he had left it on the orangery table deliberately and gone out for 20 minutes and then come back without mentioning it, which was about as close to an invitation as she had yet received. The old drawing was inside. It looked almost exactly like the view from the bench. The only difference was that in the new one, there was a figure in the left corner of the frame, a woman in a work apron with her hair loose, tending the white rose. He had not mentioned this either. She sat down beside him and showed him the letter. He read it without speaking, and when he had finished, he looked at the rose wall for a while. Then he said, "He loved you, in the ways he could manage." "In the very small ways," said Rose. She had intended this to come out as dry humour, but it came out as something else, and she did not try to correct it. He said, "Small ways add up, ways, over a lifetime." She thought of all the small ways, her mother's letters, the summers in the cottage, the twice he had stood at the far end of the garden and watched her work, the fact that the will existed at all. Alistair arrived on Friday with a document he presented, with significant ceremony, as a codicil to the Duke's will, an addition dated 3 weeks before the Duke's death, revoking the bequest to Rose and naming Alistair as the residual inheritor of the Abbey. It was very neatly done. The paper was old. The handwriting was close enough to the Duke's to give a forger's satisfaction. The seal was an exact reproduction. Alistair's man stood at his shoulder with an expression of rehearsed confidence. Rose looked at it across the table. Theo, beside her, said nothing. "The original will," Rose said, "was lodged with the Duke's primary solicitor 6 months before the date on this codicil. The paper you are holding is too white. My father's hands trembled in the last months. You can see it in his correspondence from that period, and the hand on this document is steady. The seal has been impressed with slightly more force than my father, who had arthritis in the right hand from 1817, was capable of applying." She paused. Additionally, the wording of the final clause uses a legal formula that was changed by statute in 1819 and would not have been used by a competent solicitor in 1820. She set her hands flat on the table. "I believe you will find, when the court examines it, that this document is a forgery." Alistair's expression remained confident for approximately 4 seconds longer, and then it became something else. The rain came, to that evening, as it had come before, the flat, authoritative rain of October, when the Cotswolds are making their final argument for the year. And they were in the garden again, she and Theo, because the rain had come suddenly and caught them both at the end of the west path, and this time there was no arbour nearby, and they stood in the shelter of the old yew at the garden's corner, and the rain came down around them, and none of it was the argument she had been using last time. She said, "I am frightened." He looked at her with his full attention, the way he had been looking at her more and more. "Not of Alistair," she said. "Not of the court. I am frightened of getting this. I have spent my whole life being the person who stands in the corner at the will reading, who tends the garden under someone else's name, who is present without being claimed. And if I get this, if this becomes mine, I do not know who I am without the invisibility. It has been my protection for so long. She had not meant to say that. She had been thinking it for weeks. But the rain and the October dark and the fact of this man beside her, who was watching her as though she were a view worth looking at, had made the saying of it possible. "I know something about that," Theo said. He turned, and the rain ran off the yew above them, and he looked like a man choosing, very deliberately, to put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. "I have been a duty for 30 years. I have been a Kilmore, and a creditor, and a claimant, and a lord. I do not know with any certainty what I am underneath those things, except that this autumn in this garden I have been more nearly myself than I have been since I was 9 years old." He paused. "I think that is something you have done." The rain ran in the leaves. The yew was fragrant in the wet. She looked at him, and he was closer than the rainstorm made strictly necessary, and his face had the expression of a man who has arrived, finally, at the thing he has been circling. And then, from the direction of the house, Mr. Finch called out into the rain that the north garden gate had blown open and the damask beds needed covering. And the moment broke apart in the practical direction of canvas and stakes, and they moved apart in the rain, and it was the second time the garden had interrupted them, and she thought as she ran for the potting shed, "I cannot keep letting the garden save me from this." She did not know yet how much closer the garden was to finishing the job. On the 4th of November, on a morning when the Cotswold Valley was hung with low autumn mist, and the last of the season's roses were giving their pale, frost-touched final argument for existence, the parties to the matter of the Whitfield bequest assembled in the rose garden of the Abbey for the final review. This had been Rose's idea, and it had not been without opposition. The solicitors had preferred a chancery chamber. Mr. Alistair Langley had preferred any location that was not the Abbey's grounds, for reasons that were now fairly obvious. The Dowager Countess of Kilmore, who had arrived 2 days earlier in a carriage of impressive vintage and a state of perfect calm that suggested she had been expecting to arrive eventually and had simply been waiting for the right moment, had said, when consulted, that she thought it an excellent idea and that the light would be better outdoors. The Dowager was 71 and had the quality of a woman who has seen everything worth seeing and has consequently stopped being surprised by any of it. She had taken a cup of tea in the orangery on her first morning and looked around at the neat potted specimens and the old stone and the two people who moved through the space with the unconscious ease of people who have grown into a room. And she had said to Theo, "I see." And he had said, "Grandmother." And she had said, "I am very glad, Theodore. I have been waiting for this for rather a long time." She had told Rose, privately, on the second morning, standing in the north garden beside the white rose of York, "I knew your mother. Not well. Well enough. She was a remarkable woman. You have her hands." She looked at the rose with the expression of a person looking at a thing that has been there through a great deal. She had Rose's mother's letters read to her when Rose offered them, and listened with her eyes closed, and was quiet for a little while afterward, and then said, "I have known the truth of that marriage for 20 years. I had reasons for not speaking. They seemed good reasons at the time. They seem smaller now," Rose said, carefully. "The reasons for not speaking are not entirely gone." "Clara," said the Dowager. "Yes, she is a good girl. She does not deserve the machinery of it." There was a pause. I believe there may be a way to establish what needs establishing without requiring the machinery to run over everything in its path. It requires certain parties to exercise a degree of discretion they have not, to this point, displayed. She had looked, at this point, at the gate through which Alistair Langley would arrive the following morning, with an expression that suggested the discretion she had in mind was not Alistair's. On the morning of the review, the gathered parties stood among the rose beds, while the mist moved in the valley beyond the garden wall, and the solicitors spread their papers on a table that Mr. Finch had carried out himself and set up with the careful deliberateness of a man who has prepared many things for many years and is ready, now, for the preparation to be finished. Alistair produced his forged codicil. The court's appointed examiner looked at it with the measured expression of a man who has seen many forgeries and does not find them personally offensive, merely professionally interesting. He noted the paper quality. He noted the steadiness of the hand. He noted the outdated legal formula. He produced his own comparison documents. The forger's work, which had been good enough for a cursory inspection, was not good enough for an expert's examination, and the conclusion was spoken aloud in the autumn air without drama, because the facts did not require drama to be facts. Alistair said that the examination was prejudiced. The examiner said, with patience, that the examination was complete. Mr. Finch stood up from his chair beside the rose bed and said, in the plain voice of a man who has been a gardener for 40 years and does not find legal proceedings inherently more important than weather or soil conditions, "I have a letter." He produced the Duke's letter. He read the relevant section aloud. He sat down. In the silence that followed, Clara, who had been standing at the edge of the assembled group, with the expression of a young woman who has been thinking very hard about something for several days, stepped forward. She had come to the Abbey 3 days before, at Rose's invitation, and she had been shown the letters in the still room, and she and Rose had sat together for 2 hours in the orangery, and had what Rose later described to Lydia, in a letter she was in the process of not finishing, as the most honest conversation they had ever had in 12 years of being called sisters. Clara said, "I do not contest my sister's claim to this property." She looked at Rose when she said this, and then, because Clara was, underneath the shelter of her certainties, a woman of considerable grace, she should have had it from the beginning. There was a great deal more to be done, legally and practically, and it would take the better part of the winter to complete it properly, and none of that needs to be given to you in its full administrative detail, because the detail is not where the story lives. What I want to give you instead is what happened after the examiner had packed his papers and the solicitors had gone away to do the long work of closing things out, and Alistair had been escorted firmly to his carriage by a very polite but absolutely immovable young man, who turned out to have been engaged for precisely this purpose by the Dowager Countess, who prepared for eventualities with military thoroughness. When the garden had emptied out to the last of the household, and the low November sun was burning the mist off the valley, and the whole of the garden was in a gold-grey autumn light that made everything in it look like a thing worth keeping, Theo came to find Rose. She was, of course, in the rose beds. She was kneeling beside the north wall, and the white rose of York was sending up one last small bud on the season's final cane, small and tight and pale, and she had not yet decided whether to cut it for the house or leave it to open in the cold. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path, and she did not look up, because she was watching the rose, and she was also steeling herself for something, and she had found over the years of her life that steeling yourself was best done while looking at something real. He stopped beside her. She looked up. He was not on one knee yet. He was standing, looking at her with the expression that had no word in the tone's vocabulary, but that she had been learning to read for 3 months, as fluently as she read the language of the roses. He said, "I have been thinking about what to say to you, and I have had several opportunities and said the wrong things repeatedly, and I have decided that the wrong things are the result of trying to say it correctly, so I'm going to say it without the correct version." She waited. "I came here to claim an abbey," said Theo. "I stayed because one stubborn, brilliant gardener showed me that legacy is not stone and title. It is the life we choose to nurture together. Marry me, Rose. Not for the will, not for the roses, but because without you the gardens, and I, would wither." The rose on the winter cane opened, as though the morning had been waiting for exactly the right moment to make its point. Rose looked at the flower. She looked at Theo. She looked at the garden around her mother's garden, her own garden, the garden that had held her real name safe for 20 years while the world called her by other names. And she felt, quite clearly, the answer to the question she had been holding since she stood in the still room with her mother's letters. "Yes," she said. She was laughing. There were tears somewhere in the proximity of the laughter, but she had decided not to be embarrassed about that, because it was November, and the garden was extraordinary, and a man she had not expected to love had just told her, with complete sincerity, that he would wither without her, which was the most accurate and the most generous thing anyone had ever said to her. "Yes, but I want it on record that I will continue to disagree with you about the estate accounts." "I expect nothing less," said Theo. "I have learned to think of our disagreements as one of the garden's finest features." He gave her his hand. She took it. The scar on his left hand was familiar to her now. She had touched it without meaning to, once, helping him out of a tangle of climbing rose, and the familiarity of it was its own kind of answer. They sat together on the stone bench by the white rose wall for a while, and the November sun was doing its best, and the valley was spread out below them in its autumn gold, and neither of them said anything about it being the right view at last, because they were both too sensible to say things like that. But they were both thinking it. They married in the rose garden in April, when the early roses were barely open, the gallicas first, the deepest pink ones along the west wall, and the old damask by the south gate, and the first improbable flush of the white rose of York. Mr. Finch wore his good coat. Clara cried. The Dowager Countess did not cry, but she took Rose's hand briefly before the ceremony and held it for a moment and said only, "Your mother would have been very glad." And Rose said, "I know. She would have liked you." And the Dowager said, with a ghost of something that might have been amusement, "She did, actually." We corresponded, which was the sort of thing the Dowager said that closed all questions at once and opened 30 others. By May, the Abbey had a rhythm to it that was different from any rhythm it had ever had before, which was the rhythm of a house that is genuinely inhabited, not managed, not maintained, not held against a claim. Inhabited, meaning that the people in it had chosen it and it had chosen them back, and the arrangement was daily renewed in small acts of care that had nothing to do with property and everything to do with the kind of love that grows slowly in good soil, given enough light. Theo continued to sketch. His sketchbooks, post-November, contained almost exclusively the Abbey and its gardens, the same garden, the same views, from slightly different angles as the seasons changed, as though the sketchbook were a record of a place being lived in fully for the first time. Rose found one on the table in the orangery one morning and opened it and counted. The figure in the left corner of the frame, the woman tending the roses, appeared in 47 of the 60 drawings. He had never mentioned this. She chose not to mention it either, because some things are more fully said by being kept. The question of the marriage and the codicil was resolved in the end by the dowager's careful management and the cooperation of Clara, who had turned out to be a person of considerably more courage than anyone, including Clara, had given her credit for. The relevant facts were established quietly and in the form that protected what needed protecting, and the larger questions were handled in a way that closed without public record, and Alistair Langley went to live in Edinburgh, which was understood by everyone to be sufficient consequence for his contribution to the proceedings. Clara settled, not in the defeated way of the word, but in the real way, into a life that fitted her eventually, with a man who was steady and kind and thought she was the most interesting person he had ever met, which she was, once she had been given the opportunity to be interesting. She visited the Abbey every summer. She had never, in her life before, been able to visit it honestly. She told Rose on her first honest visit that the roses were extraordinary, and Rose said, "They were always extraordinary." And Clara said, "Yes, but I couldn't see it before." And Rose understood that she did not mean the roses. Thomas's commission was funded. He served well. He came home on leave in the second summer and walked the gardens with a proprietary approval that made Rose laugh, and Theo regard him with the fond exasperation of a man who has acquired a brother-in-law and found, to his surprise, that the acquisition is an improvement. On the last morning of the epilogue, I want to give you a morning in early May, when the valley was doing something extraordinary with the light. Rose and Theo walked the rose paths at dawn, as they had done most mornings of that first year, because the habits of two people who love each other are built from the things they have always done alone and have found, in combination, to be better. The early roses were open along the west wall. The white rose of York was beginning to bud. The birds were making an absolute production of the morning in the trees above the stone wall, and somewhere behind them in the Abbey kitchen, Mr. Finch was very likely making tea. Rose said, "I was thinking we should try the Souvenir de la Malmaison in the south border this season." Theo said, "I thought the soil in the south border was too dry." Rose said, "It was. I have been amending it since October." Theo considered this. He said, "What will it look like when it blooms?" Rose said, "Like something worth coming home to." He linked his fingers through hers, and they walked on along the rose path. And the morning was everything mornings in a rose garden in May can be, which is extraordinary. And they had the whole season ahead of them, and the one after that, and the one after that. And the garden was full of the particular promise that gardens keep only for the people who know how to ask for it, which is to say, the promise of the next thing blooming, and the next, and the next. And that, my dear listeners, is where I leave them. In the morning light of Whitfield Abbey, hands linked, planning the next season's roses, which is not the smallest version of a life well made. It is, if anything, the most precise one. To know what you are growing toward, and to grow toward it together, and to tend the thing between you with the same care you give to everything else you love. You have sat by this fire all the way through an autumn and a winter and a rose garden in morning light, and I am not going to pretend I could have told this story without you at the other end of it. If it has given you something, a feeling, a warmth, a particular wish that somewhere in the world a Cotswold rose garden exists exactly like this one, then I want to ask you to subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, because there are many more of these, and every one of them has a heart, like this one has a heart, and I would hate for you to miss any of them. It costs you nothing. It means more than I can tell you from this side of the fire. And if you still will not subscribe, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me a favor. You have owed me one since the beginning of this story. I am patient. I always collect. Good night, and mind the roses.